Arabian Food and Drug Authority has approved the importation of meat and meat products from South Africa. This comes after inspections carried out in June this year by SAFTA. The authority looked at South African abattoirs and feedlots for compliance in terms of market access protocols and halal certification into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The approval is a direct outcome of the state visit by President Ramaphosa to the Saudi Kingdom in October last year. The Saudi market is valued at over $5 billion.
The South African Saudi Arabia Business Council has committed to boosting trade between the two countries as part of efforts to grow the two countries' respective economies. This includes the renewal of a deal by Saudi Arabia to import meat from South Africa. Saudi Arabia has a $2 billion meat market, and lifting the ban is part of its efforts to forge stronger trade and investment ties.
Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development says plans are now afoot to start exporting lamb and beef products to Saudi Arabia after companies' compliance regulations were ironed out. The ban was triggered by the outbreak of foot and mouth disease in South Africa.
Breaking. A major shift is unfolding in the global food trade, and it is quietly changing long-standing supply relationships. South Africa has begun supplying beef to Saudi Arabia at scale, a move that is already reshaping trade flows that once favored the United States. This is not a symbolic agreement. It is a commercial decision based on price, reliability, standards, and long-term strategy, and its effects are spreading far beyond agriculture. For years, the United States was one of the dominant suppliers of beef to the Middle East. American exporters benefited from established logistics, long contracts, and strong diplomatic ties. In the region, Saudi Arabia, as one of the world's largest food importers, relied heavily on trusted external suppliers to ensure food security. Beef imports were part of that system, but recent trade data shows a clear change. South African beef exports to Saudi Arabia have increased, while American volumes have slowed. This did not happen overnight. It followed inspections, certifications, negotiations, and pricing adjustments. Once those conditions were met, the market responded. South Africa's cattle industry has expanded its export readiness in recent years. Investments in veterinary controls, cold chain logistics, and halal-compliant processing helped open doors in the Gulf region. Saudi buyers prioritize consistency, health standards, and long-term supply stability. South Africa positioned itself to meet those expectations. Cost is another factor. Beef prices have been rising globally. Feed costs, energy prices, and transport expenses have affected producers everywhere. South African beef has remained competitive in pricing, especially when shipping routes and currency exchange rates are taken into account. Buyers looking to manage food inflation are paying close attention. This change matters because food trade is not just about meat. It reflects trust, reliability, and strategic alignment. When a country shifts suppliers, it signals confidence in a new partner. Analysts warn that once supply chains adjust, they rarely snap back quickly. For the United States, this development adds pressure to an already strained agricultural export environment. American farmers are facing higher production costs, tighter margins, and increased competition from emerging exporters. Losing market share in a major importing country reduces revenue and weakens bargaining power in future trade talks. This could mean more volatility for American beef producers. When exports slow, domestic supply increases that can push prices down at home, affecting farm income. Rural economies that depend on agriculture feel these shifts first. The implications extend beyond beef. Saudi Arabia has been actively diversifying its food suppliers to reduce risk. Relying on one or two countries creates vulnerability during trade disputes, shipping disruptions, or political disagreements. Expanding imports from Africa fits a broader strategy of supply diversification. South Africa benefits not only from export revenue, but also from deeper trade ties with the Gulf. Livestock exports support jobs across farming, processing, logistics, and quality control. They also strengthen South Africa's position as a reliable food supplier to fast-growing regions. Analysts warn that this trend could encourage other African producers to scale up exports. Countries watching South Africa's success may invest in similar systems. If that happens, competition in global meat markets will intensify. This shift also highlights how global trade is becoming more multipolar. Traditional exporters no longer dominate by default. Buyers are comparing options more aggressively. Quality, price, and reliability now matter more than history. There are regulatory dimensions as well. South Africa worked closely with importing authorities to meet health and safety requirements. Compliance built trust. Exporters who fail to adapt to evolving standards risk being replaced. This could mean global markets reward flexibility over size. From a geopolitical perspective, food security is becoming a strategic issue. Countries that can supply essential goods gain influence. Long-term food contracts create stable relationships that extend beyond economics. Analysts warn that losing ground in food trade can reduce broader influence over time. For consumers in Saudi Arabia, diversified sourcing may help stabilize prices. For consumers in the United States, changes in export demand could influence domestic pricing patterns. These outcomes are interconnected. It is important to note that this development does not mean the United States is exiting the market entirely. American beef remains globally competitive and widely consumed, but it does mean competition is stronger and buyers are more willing to shift. South Africa's entry into this space reflects preparation rather than chance. Infrastructure, standards, and policy alignment all played roles. This could mean that future trade winners will be those who invest early in compliance and logistics. As global demand for protein continues to rise, supply decisions will shape economic fortunes. Agriculture is no longer a background industry. It's at the center of trade, inflation, and security discussions. The bigger question now is how exporters respond. Will traditional suppliers adapt pricing, standards, and logistics fast enough to retain markets? Will emerging suppliers maintain quality as volumes grow? And as food trade becomes more competitive and strategic, how will these shifts reshape global influence in the years ahead? As the beef trade shift between South Africa and Saudi Arabia settles into place, a second wave of consequences is beginning to surface, and this part of the story may be even more significant than the initial trade numbers. What looks like a simple supplier change is slowly reshaping expectations across global agriculture, trade alliances, and food security planning. One of the most important developments is how Saudi Arabia is using this deal as a signal. By moving toward South Africa, Saudi buyers are showing that they are willing to look beyond traditional suppliers when conditions change. This sends a message to every exporting nation that access to major markets is no longer guaranteed. It must be earned continuously. Analysts warn that markets which feel secure today may face sudden competition tomorrow if they fail to adapt. This could mean that American beef exporters will need to rethink how they approach international buyers. Pricing strategies, contract flexibility, shipping efficiency, and certification speed all come into focus. In a global environment where margins are tight, even small inefficiencies can decide who wins a contract and who loses it. There is also a deeper supply chain issue emerging. South Africa's beef exports are not only about cattle farms, they rely on feed producers, transport firms, veterinary services, processing plants, ports, and cold storage facilities. Increased exports strengthen this entire ecosystem. As volumes rise, costs per unit often fall, making exports even more competitive. Analysts warn that once this cycle begins, it becomes difficult for competitors to reverse. For the United States, the concern is not just losing one market, it is the possibility that other buyers may follow similar paths. Middle Eastern importers communicate with each other. They compare prices, quality, and reliability. If South African beef continues to perform well, additional contracts could follow in nearby markets. This could mean a gradual erosion of market share rather than a sudden collapse. Those are often the most dangerous shifts because they attract less attention until the impact is widespread. By the time producers react, relationships may already be established elsewhere. Another layer of the story involves geopolitics and economic alignment. Food trade builds trust over time. When a country becomes a reliable supplier of essential goods, it gains a voice in broader economic discussions. Long-term food contracts often open doors to investment talks, infrastructure cooperation, and financial partnerships. Analysts warn that losing these links reduces influence in ways that are hard to measure immediately. South Africa's growing role also reflects Africa's broader push to move up the value chain. Exporting raw materials alone limits earnings. Exporting processed, regulated food products increases value and stability. This shift aligns with continental strategies focused on industrialization and trade self-reliance. The impact on rural economies is another important aspect. Beef exports support employment not only in cities but also in farming regions. Stable international demand encourages investment in breeding, animal health, and land management. Over time, this can improve productivity and sustainability. This could mean South Africa strengthens its agricultural base while competitors struggle with oversupply. Meanwhile, American producers face a different reality. When exports decline, domestic markets absorb more supply that can lower prices even when production costs remain high. Farmers already operating on thin margins may feel additional strain. Analysts warn that prolonged pressure can lead to consolidation, with smaller operations exiting the industry. This situation also intersects with environmental and regulatory expectations. Importing countries are increasingly attentive to production methods, traceability, and sustainability. South Africa has worked to align its systems with these demands. Exporters who cannot meet evolving standards risk being sidelined, regardless of scale. From the perspective of Saudi Arabia, diversification is a form of insurance. Food security has become a top priority globally. Climate events, conflicts, and shipping disruptions have exposed vulnerabilities. Relying on a single supplier or region is now seen as a risk. This could mean that even if American beef remains competitive, it may no longer dominate as it once did. There is also a financial angle. Trade diversification can improve negotiating power. When buyers have alternatives, pricing discussions change. Suppliers must compete more actively. Analysts warn that dominant exporters who lose pricing power often struggle to regain it. This shift is not isolated to beef. Similar patterns are appearing in poultry, grains, and other food commodities. Africa's role as a supplier is expanding as infrastructure improves and policies align with export goals. This could mean a long-term rebalancing of global food trade. For global markets, increased competition can be positive. It can stabilize prices and reduce dependency risks, but it also increases pressure on producers to innovate and adapt. Those who fail to evolve may be pushed out, regardless of past dominance. It is important to emphasize that this development is not about conflict or confrontation. It is about economics. Buyers choose suppliers based on value, reliability, and strategy. No country is entitled to a market forever. Analysts warn that assuming permanence in global trade is one of the most costly mistakes as this story continues. Attention will turn to how quickly exporters respond. Will pricing structures adjust? Will logistics improve? Will certification processes accelerate? The answers to these questions will shape who leads the next phase of global food trade. The shift toward South African beef in Saudi Arabia may appear narrow today, but it reflects a broader transformation. Trade power is becoming more distributed. Emerging suppliers are stepping into roles once dominated by a few nations. Food, once considered a stable and predictable sector, is now a dynamic arena of competition. The final question is not simply who supplies beef to whom. It is about how global trade adapts when new players prove they can deliver. As traditional exporters face rising costs and new competition, and emerging suppliers gain confidence and capability, will the future of food trade reward adaptability over history, and which countries are truly prepared for that reality?